In hindsight, I guess we shouldn't have been surprised that Reaganism would lead to corporate fascism, but here we are. By now, you probably have heard the basics of what Ronald Reagan believed in and stood for. The veneration of capitalism, the hatred of the federal government, and the worship of wealth and the wealthy. But what you haven't heard is how all these ideas together provided the ideological ammunition needed to prepare America for fascist authoritarianism. Reagan's first goal wasn't political, it was ideological. Before he could change how Americans voted or what they voted for, he had to change the way they thought, convincing them, contrary to the conventional wisdom at the time, that government couldn't be relied upon to meaningfully improve people's lives. He famously declared, "Government is not the solution to the problem. Government is the problem." With that line, Reagan wasn't just taking a swipe at bureaucrats. He was remaking the entire political consensus that had defined the nation since the Great Depression and New Deal. That consensus had shown people that government can actually do some pretty amazing things when it wants to. It could create a robust social safety net, invest in public services, and build an economy that delivered the most broadly shared prosperity in human history. So how do you convince people that the very public programs responsible for their economic security, healthcare, and social mobility are somehow bad for them? Easy. Good old-fashioned racism. Given today's rampant paranoia about socialism and right-wing fear-mongering about anything remotely left of center, it may be hard to believe, but Americans weren't always so skeptical of public investments and social welfare programs. In fact, there was such a time when such benefits were considered essential to the flourishing of society and the common good, as long as the primary beneficiaries were white. Historically, many public benefits were designed to systematically exclude people of color, ensuring that the privileges of social and economic advancement remained overwhelmingly in white hands. Take the Homestead Act of 1862, for example. It promised free land grants to citizens or those eligible for citizenship. Unfortunately, at the time, that excluded Black Americans. Black people were similarly excluded during the Great Depression, when government-backed home insurance programs that helped white Americans achieve home ownership systematically excluded Black citizens. Other transformative social programs of the New Deal, like the GI Bill, celebrated for their impact on American society, were also riddled with racial inequities. Racist Southern Democrats made sure that jobs predominantly held by Black workers were excluded from New Deal protections and programs. And discriminatory local administrators stopped Black veterans from accessing the educational and housing benefits promised by the GI Bill. Federal investments in infrastructure and suburban development were no better. Racial covenants and other discriminatory practices kept Black people from reaping the benefits of suburban living and home ownership. The pattern is clear. When white people were seen as the primary beneficiary of public investments and social welfare, these programs were seen as essential to the nation's prosperity. But when access to those benefits expanded, or even threatened to expand, to include people of color, enthusiasm for public investment waned. And that's where Ronald Reagan came in. It took just over a decade after the core achievements of the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, all of which Ronald Reagan opposed, by the way, for Americans to turn against the whole equality thing. But saying it out loud kind of didn't sound great, so they had Reagan do it for them. Reagan's rhetoric about welfare queens and deadbeats wasn't just casually racist, it was deliberate. By painting federal programs as handouts for undeserving minorities, he made the American people view these programs, and by extension, the entire federal government, with contempt. Reagan's genius, if you want to call it that, was realizing that in order to make Americans despise the federal government, he had to associate it with people and groups this country was already predisposed to despise. This was the ideological win Reagan needed to kick off an unprecedented divestment from the public sphere. From there, the rest was simple. Make the initial assertion that government couldn't work for ordinary people a self-fulfilling prophecy. First, you convince voters that government doesn't work for them, and then when you get into office, you gut social services until government actually is incapable of delivering for normal people, thereby proving your point. And when people's living standards predictably decline, distract them with racial and cultural wedge issues to keep the working class divided amongst itself. This creates a vicious cycle. The government fails to deliver for people, the public's anger and cynicism deepen, Political divisions grow more intense, and as frustration mounts, large swaths of the population turn to politicians who manipulate them with divisive rhetoric. Politicians who, once in power, implement more policies that further erode the government's ability to help people. It was a masterclass in political manipulation, and it paved the way for the decades of erosion and exploitation that followed. But it didn't end there. Reagan's narrative didn't just give the American people a new set of villains, the federal government and the minorities it supposedly coddled. The story wouldn't be complete without a new set of heroes, and Reagan knew just who would fit the bill. Corporations. The 1980s did not shy away from materialism. It outright embraced it. Excess wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. And that attitude came right from Ronald Reagan's glorification of capitalism, particularly in stark contrast to the evil empire of Soviet communism. American corporations and the CEOs and founders behind them became celebrities. They weren't just business leaders anymore, they were cultural icons, held up as paragons of unparalleled genius and ingenuity. Wealth wasn't something to be questioned or scrutinized. It was the ultimate proof of individual competence, taken as gospel by an increasingly materialistic society. This is the reason why our society equates wealth with intelligence. It's why someone like Donald Trump, a man who stumbles through sentences, shows no signs of understanding complex issues, and appears to have never read a book in his life, can still be seen by so many people as a competent leader. The logic is simple. He's rich, therefore he's successful, therefore he must be qualified, even when the evidence of his disqualifications is overwhelming. This is Reagan's legacy, shifting the public's trust away from government and toward private companies and the men that run them. And the result? The public didn't just tolerate corporate dominance, they cheered it on, even as it steadily dismantled the very systems that were meant to protect them. It matters a great deal for our present purposes that the corporation itself is an inherently authoritarian social structure. A corporation operates on a strict hierarchy with decisions flowing top-down. Workers, no matter what their expertise or contributions, are expected to follow orders and conform to the vision of the leader, a singular CEO or founder. Dissent is rarely tolerated, and checks on power are virtually non-existent. This is because constraints on the authority of a single chief executive are fundamentally incompatible with the corporate ideology that glorifies the decisive leader. The belief that an organization's success depends entirely on one person's vision. This isn't just a celebrated idea in capitalism. It's a foundational principle of it. In this narrative, CEOs and founders are mythologized as singular visionary figures, the kinds of people who take charge, make tough calls, and single-handedly guide their organizations to greatness. The corporate world thrives on this cult of the decisive leader, framing success as the work of one man's vision rather than the product of collective effort. At its core, this ideology is about maximizing the power for one man to make bold, unilateral decisions, free from constraints, checks or balances, or any meaningful accountability. It glorifies the leader unburdened by the messy compromises of democracy. Someone who can act decisively without being slowed down by all these pesky things like debate and dissent and oversight. The contrast between the private and public sectors couldn't be clearer in this picture. Where the bureaucrat is inept, the businessman is confident. Where the bureaucrat is timid and unsure of himself, the businessman is bold and decisive. Where the bureaucrat dithers endlessly, the businessman gets things done. The narrative of capitalism's magical efficiency became one of the most enduring framing devices of the Reagan era. It explains why our political discourse keeps circling back to the idea that government should be run like a business. Lean, efficient, and free from all that pesky red tape. You know, those things like separation of powers, the rule of law, the Constitution, it's all just getting in the way of America being star-spangled awesome. It's what fuels our country's obsession with privatizing everything. From schools to hospitals, prisons, or even, as Trump recently floated, the US Postal Service. The promise is always the same. Turn something over to private corporations and magically it'll work better. Since Reagan, the message has been clear. If you want solutions, you're not going to find them in the messy bureaucratic halls of a government that has been designed not to work. You'll find them in the private sector, where decisive leaders, unshackled by procedural constraints, reign supreme. With that groundwork laid, it was only a matter of time before Americans began searching for a political outsider, ideally a businessman, who could drain the swamp and finally fix what they had come to see as a broken system. It's no coincidence that Trump himself was one of the most notorious and prominent poster boys for the material excess and greed that Reagan's 1980s inspired. Back then, Trump was the walking embodiment of, if you've got it, flaunt it. A brash, self-aggrandizing real estate mogul whose name became synonymous with glitz, gaudiness, and ruthless ambition. He wasn't just a product of the Reagan era, he was its mascot.